The heat of the Texas afternoon clung to everything like a wet sheet of dust. At the county livestock auction, sweat and tobacco filled the air, mingling with the scent of hay and old regret. Laughter erupted near the auction ring, loud, rowdy, and mean-spirited. In the middle of the pen stood a pony, short, stocky, with awkward legs and a mane like a tangled mop. His name was Trigger, though nobody in that crowd bothered to ask. He stood still, head lowered, eyes dull, absorbing the jeers that cut deeper than whips ever could. "Looks like his legs gave up halfway through growin'," shouted Tommy Ray Jenkins, the kind of man who laughed hardest when others were quiet. Men clung to the rails, elbowing each other, enjoying the show. For them, Trigger wasn't a horse. He was a joke with hooves. The more they laughed, the smaller Trigger seemed to become, shrinking not in size, but in spirit. He had been shuffled from barn to barn, left behind, unwanted. The auction was supposed to offer a fresh start, but instead, it became yet another humiliation in a life full of them. Some even suggested he was better off put down. He didn't flinch. He didn't fight. He just stood, like he already knew how it would end. But among the crowd, there was one man who didn't laugh. Roy Lancaster stood in the shadow of the gate, arms folded, face set like stone. His clothes were plain, worn with time, and his boots were coated in years of work. He was no stranger to pain, and no stranger to silence. At 71, he had buried a wife, outlived a son, and watched the land dry up beneath his feet. He hadn't planned on bidding today. But when Trigger's eyes met his, quiet, broken, pleading, it felt like the past had reached out and grabbed his chest with both hands. The auctioneer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "All right, folks. What do I hear for this fella? Starting at 5? Come on now." Silence. A snort. Then Tommy Ray again. "I'll give you $1 just to take that mistake home." The laughter returned, louder this time. The auctioneer tried again. 5, 3, anyone. Then Roy's voice cut through the noise like a rusted blade. 10. It wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. The men turned. One man chuckled. "You serious, Roy?" Tommy Ray leaned forward. "Gonna start a circus?" Roy didn't answer. He stepped into the ring, ignoring their stares, eyes locked on Trigger. The gavel fell. Sold. $10 to Roy Lancaster. The gate creaked open. Trigger didn't move. Not at first. Then, as Roy reached out, something shifted. The pony took one cautious step, then leaned into the old man's palm. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. What had started as a joke to others had just become the beginning of a story neither of them could imagine. If this story touched your heart already, hit that like button. Trigger's journey is just beginning, and Roy's quiet act of courage might change everything. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next, because sometimes broken things heal each other. The drive back to Roy Lancaster's ranch was quiet, the kind of silence that filled a man's chest more than any noise ever could. Trigger rode in the back of the old stock trailer, swaying gently with every bump in the dirt road. Roy glanced at the side mirror now and then, catching glimpses of the small pony standing alone among shadows. He wasn't sure why he'd done it. $10 wasn't much, but it was something. Still, it wasn't the money that lingered in Roy's mind. It was that look in the pony's eyes. Like he'd been waiting for someone who never came. Until today. The sun dipped behind the hills as the truck rolled through the rusted metal gate of the Lancaster property. The place had seen better days, fences leaning from years of wind, paint peeled off the barn like old skin. Roy hadn't brought a new animal home in over a decade. The barn smelled of old hay and forgotten memories. As he led Trigger out of the trailer, the pony hesitated. His hooves clinked against the ramp, and his body stiffened, as if unsure whether this place was just another stop on the long road of disappointment. Roy gave the lead rope a gentle tug. "You're all right," he murmured. Ain't nobody Logan here. Inside the barn, Roy cleared out a stall that had once belonged to a chestnut gelding named Buck, a horse his late son, Daniel, had raised from a colt. That stall had been empty ever since the accident. Roy paused as he threw down fresh straw, his hand resting briefly on the wooden gate. The weight of that memory still pressed on his chest like wet earth. Trigger stepped in slowly, sniffing the corners, ears flicking at every creak and whisper of wind. But he didn't panic. He settled. It was quiet. Safe. Later that night, Roy sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee and the old barn light casting a golden glow in the distance. Trigger had eaten without fuss, and now the barn was still. Roy watched the stars emerge over the horizon, thinking of things he hadn't let himself feel in years. Soft things, dangerous things. A part of him, long buried, stirred. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But the presence of that little horse had unsettled something he thought was dead. Inside the house, he passed by a faded photo on the wall. Daniel at 16, beaming beside Buck, holding a rodeo ribbon in one hand and their future in the other. Roy hadn't touched that frame in years. Tonight, though, he did. Just for a second. His fingers traced the edge before he walked on, heart heavier than usual. But deep in the barn, Trigger shifted in his stall, then let out a single strange sound. A noise Roy hadn't heard from a horse in a long, long time. Almost like a call. Roy awoke before dawn, like he always did, though this morning felt different. There was a weight in his chest he couldn't name, something pressing against his ribs like a buried truth rising toward the surface. The old house creaked with the chill of early morning. He poured himself coffee, black and bitter, then stepped onto the porch, where the barn's silhouette waited in the mist. The light above Trigger's stall still glowed faintly. Roy had left it on the night before, without thinking. Or maybe he had. Maybe he just couldn't bear the thought of the little horse alone in the dark. Inside the barn, Trigger stood quiet but alert. His eyes followed Roy as he approached, calm but unreadable. Roy opened the stall and stepped in, brushing his hand gently down Trigger's neck. The coat was coarse in places, smoother in others, like the horse had been cared for once, and then forgotten. As he ran the brush along Trigger's side, his fingers caught on something odd just behind the shoulder, a scar. Long, deep, partially hidden beneath the fur. Roy froze. He'd seen that kind of mark before, years ago. It wasn't from barbed wire. It was from something intentional. Controlled. Like a training injury, or punishment. Roy's breath caught in his throat. His mind drifted back, blurry memories of a summer long gone, of a boy's voice, of boots running across the barn floor. Daniel had once rescued a pony. Short-legged, red-coated. It had been a project of his, a secret almost, taken in when Roy was too busy with drought and debt to notice. Could it be? No, that was impossible. That pony had vanished after Daniel died. Roy had assumed the horse had been sold or let loose by someone cleaning up the boys' things. Still, his hands trembled now as he ran them over the old wound again. Was Trigger that pony? A knock at the front gate startled him out of his thoughts. He squinted toward the fence, where a beat-up pickup idled in a cloud of dust. A younger man leaned out the window, chewing on a toothpick. "Mr. Lancaster?" he called. Roy walked slowly toward the truck, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah." The man shifted in his seat. "Name's Clay Turner. I heard you bought a short-legged pony at the auction yesterday. Mind if I ask you a couple questions about him?" Roy narrowed his eyes. "What kind of questions?" Clay hesitated. "The kind you probably weren't expectin'. That horse. He used to belong to someone real important, and someone real dangerous." Roy tightened his grip on the rag in his hand, the coarse fabric digging into his calluses. The name Clay Turner didn't mean much to him, but the way the boy said important and dangerous sent a chill crawling down his spine. The morning sun was climbing now, casting long streaks of gold over the dirt, but Roy felt like the air had turned cold. He stepped closer to the gate, watching Clay's eyes. The young man wasn't cocky like the others at the auction. His jaw was tight, his posture respectful, but wary, as if he knew he was stirring up something best left alone. "What do you mean, used to belong?" Roy asked, voice low. "That horse been passed through so many hands he don't even know his own name anymore." Clay nodded, then stepped out of the truck slowly. "I work for a man named Wade Mercer. Ever heard of him?" Roy froze. The name struck like lightning in his chest, fast and violent. He hadn't heard that name in over 20 years. And he'd worked hard to keep it that way. Wade Mercer had been involved in rodeos, ranches, and darker dealings back in the 90s. Dangerous wasn't the half of it. "I knew Wade," Roy said carefully. "Long time ago." He didn't elaborate. Clay nodded again. "Trigger, if that's what you're calling him, was bred on Mercer's land. They used to call him Red Whiskey. He was supposed to be trained for performance, parades, maybe even show circuits. But Mercer's crew was rough. Real rough. Some said the ponies that didn't perform got discarded." Clay looked down, kicking a stone with his boot. "I only know because my uncle used to work for him. Trigger disappeared one night, and they said a stable hand stole him. Never found out who." Roy's heart pounded like hooves inside his chest. He turned away, looking out over his land. The wind carried the dry scent of prairie grass and pine, but to Roy it smelled like ghosts. Daniel had brought home a pony that same summer, short-legged, skittish, covered in burrs. He'd begged Roy to let him keep it. Roy had said no at first, then relented. The boy had called it Red, but never said where it came from. And after Daniel's death, the pony vanished. Just like that. "I don't know what you're looking for, son," Roy muttered. "But that animal back there, he's got a home now. Whatever Mercer wants, he's not getting him back." Clay hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I ain't here for Mercer," he said quietly. "I'm here because if that pony really came from his place, then there's a whole lot more buried in your past than just a horse. And I think you already know it." That night, the ranch was unusually still. The wind had died, the crickets seemed to hush, and even the barn stood quiet like it was listening. Roy sat alone in his living room, a single lamp casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Clay Turner had left hours earlier, but his words still rang in Roy's ears. Red Whiskey. Mercer. Stolen. Discarded. The names had weight. And the more Roy thought about it, the heavier it all became. He stared at the photo on the wall, Daniel, smiling beside his old chestnut horse. But now, that smile seemed to hide something deeper. Something Roy had missed. He rose slowly, walked to the old hallway closet, and pulled down a dusty box labeled Daniel, Rodeo. Inside were belt buckles, ribbons, and notebooks filled with doodles and scribbles. Then he found it, an old Polaroid, bent at the corner. It showed Daniel standing beside a pony, short and thick, with a reddish coat and white blaze. Roy's hand shook. The pony in the photo. It was Trigger. The same gentle eyes. The same crooked stance. But on the photo's edge, scrawled in his son's handwriting, was a single word, whiskey. He dropped into the armchair, breath caught in his throat. "Damn it, boy," he whispered. All these years, he'd thought Daniel had found the horse wandering, or maybe traded it from a neighbor. But the truth, it was darker. Daniel had stolen that pony, from Wade Mercer. Not for greed, not for glory, but to save it. Trigger hadn't just appeared in their lives. Daniel had risked everything to protect him. And Roy, so busy with bills, bitterness, and a crumbling farm, had never asked the right questions. A memory returned with a sudden, brutal clarity. Daniel arguing with someone over the phone in the barn. Roy had overheard just one line, "I don't care who he is, he's not taking him back." He'd assumed it was about some silly teenage drama. But it wasn't. It was Mercer. And now it made sense, the accident that took Daniel's life. The brakes that failed going down the ridge road. Everyone called it a tragedy. But what if it hadn't been? Roy stood suddenly, the air in the room feeling colder than before. He looked toward the barn. Trigger was in that stall, breathing peacefully, unaware of the storm his presence had awakened. But Roy knew now. This wasn't just about a horse. It never had been. Comment now. Do you think Daniel was a silent hero, or just a kid who paid too high a price for doing what's right? Comment, Trigger knew, if you believe the horse carried that secret all along. Let's talk about the truth that stayed buried for years. The next morning, Roy didn't go straight to the barn like he usually did. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with an old, rusted coffee can beside him. Inside it, a collection of notes, receipts, and letters Daniel had tucked away over the years. Most of it was junk. Feed bills, rodeo entry forms, school notes. But halfway through, folded in four and stained with oil, Roy found something that made his chest tighten. It was a torn piece of notebook paper, written in Daniel's rushed handwriting. "If anything happens to me, look into Wade Mercer." He threatened Trigger. Said I was stealing what was his. Roy read the line over and over, unable to breathe. He leaned back in the chair, eyes burning. Daniel had known he was in danger. He had tried to leave a trail, and Roy hadn't seen it, hadn't even looked. All this time, Roy had buried himself in silence, letting grief harden into guilt. Now, the pieces were snapping together like dry branches under pressure. Mercer hadn't just lost a pony. He'd lost control. And men like him never let go of things without punishment. Roy's fists clenched. The so-called accident that had killed his son no longer looked like fate, it looked like a message. Later that day, Roy drove into town. The sheriff's office hadn't changed much since the 90s. Same paneling, same tired faces. He approached the counter and asked to see Sheriff Maynard, a man who had once been close to Roy's family, back when folks still came around. The sheriff, older now, walked with a limp and suspicion in his eyes. "Roy Lancaster," he said slowly. "Ain't seen you in a while." Roy laid the folded note on the desk. "I need to know if y'all ever looked into Mercer properly after Daniel died." Maynard read the note, then set it down gently. "Roy, we found no evidence of foul play back then. The brakes failed. That's what the report said." Roy's voice cracked. "I know what the report said. But did you ever ask why? Did you ever think maybe someone helped him fail?" The sheriff sighed, long and tired. "We all knew Mercer was trouble, but he had money. Lawyers. No one was willing to dig. You think I didn't want justice for Daniel? We just didn't have enough." Back at the ranch, Trigger stood at the edge of the pasture, staring toward the hills. He seemed restless, his ears twitching, his stance alert. Roy leaned against the fence, watching him. Something was coming. Whether it was justice or trouble, he didn't know. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to run from the past anymore. Because this time, Roy Lancaster was ready to fight. The late afternoon sun bled across the sky like a warning. Roy stood by the fence line, Trigger beside him, unusually tense. The pony's ears flicked back and forth, hooves shifting against the dry dirt. Something was wrong. Roy could feel it in the stillness, in the way the wind refused to blow. The sheriff's half-hearted concern hadn't given Roy much to go on, but it had confirmed what he already feared. Wade Mercer wasn't finished. The man had power, resources, and a long memory. And now that Trigger had surfaced, Mercer wouldn't let it go unanswered. Then Roy saw it, far down the road, a black truck kicking up a long ribbon of dust. It was too new, too polished to belong to any local. His heart thudded slow and heavy. He didn't move, just watched as the vehicle approached, headlights flashing in the fading light. Trigger backed away from the gate, muscles tight, breath quick. The truck didn't slow until it reached Roy's fence. Then, with the low hiss of brakes, it stopped. A man stepped out, tall, lean, dressed in black jeans and a pearl-button shirt. His silver hair was combed back, and his boots shined like they'd never touched dirt. It had been over 20 years, but Roy knew him instantly. Wade Mercer hadn't aged like most men. He'd hardened, like stone kept under pressure. He walked to the fence with the confidence of someone who never heard the word no. "Roy," he said, voice smooth as oil. "Been a long time." Roy didn't answer. He simply crossed his arms, feet planted firm. Mercer glanced toward the pasture where Trigger now stood halfway behind the barn. "That's him, ain't it? Red whiskey. Thought he was dead." Roy's jaw tightened. "He has a name now. It's Trigger. And he's not yours." Mercer smirked. "That horse is property, Lancaster. He was stolen from my ranch. You know what that makes you." Roy stepped closer, leaning over the fence. "You gonna press charges? Go ahead. I'll be happy to tell the sheriff how my son died right after you threatened him. We'll let a judge decide what's property and what's murder." The smile faded from Mercer's face. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. The moment stretched tight, like a rope on the verge of snapping. Finally, Mercer stepped back. "You always were a fool, Roy. That horse's bloodline is worth a fortune. But I guess some men would rather hold on to ghosts than take a check." He turned, climbed into his truck, and drove off, leaving behind nothing but dust and silence. Roy stood alone at the fence. But now he knew this wasn't over. Mercer would be back. And this time, he wouldn't come alone. The sky had turned dark by the time Roy locked the barn. The silence around the ranch was heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. He couldn't sleep. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind, made his fingers twitch toward the shotgun hanging by the door. He hadn't held it in years, not since Daniel died. But tonight, something in his bones told him it was time to stop grieving and start protecting. Trigger was more than a horse now. He was the last piece of his son's story. And maybe the last chance Roy had to finish it the right way. Out by the fence line, Roy spotted it, faint at first, but unmistakable. A flicker of orange moving low through the grass, like a serpent made of flame. His chest tightened. Fire. Someone had set fire to the dry brush just past the eastern ridge. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. A threat. Roy grabbed the rifle and sprinted toward the edge of the property, his boots slamming against the cracked earth. Behind him, the wind shifted, and the first curl of smoke began to roll in over the barn roof. He reached the fire fast, stamping and smothering the dry flames with his jacket. His hands burned. His lungs filled with smoke. But it wasn't about the fire, it was about control. Mercer hadn't needed to say a word. The message was clear. Give up the horse or lose everything. Roy stared at the small blackened patch of earth beneath his boots. It wasn't much damage, but it could have been. And it would be, next time. Back at the barn, Trigger was restless, pacing in his stall. Roy opened the gate and stepped inside. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "I got you." The pony stopped and pressed his head gently into Roy's chest. The old man closed his eyes and let the silence settle between them. For a moment, all the years fell away, the mistakes, the grief, the silence. He was just a father again. A man who'd failed his son once, but wouldn't fail him twice. That night, Roy made a decision. He packed a duffel bag with essentials, loaded Trigger into the trailer, and left a note on the kitchen table. gone to finish what Daniel started. He didn't know exactly where the road would take them, maybe to the sheriff again, maybe straight to Mercer's front door. But he knew one thing: he couldn't stay idle anymore. Because some battles aren't about winning. They're about not running. The drive to Dry Creek Ranch was long and hollow. Miles of barren field stretched on either side, broken only by rusted fence posts and the ghosts of old windmills. Roy hadn't been out this way since the funeral. Not Daniel's. His own father's. Back then, Mercer had been a young man with ambition in his eyes and violence in his veins. Now, decades later, that ambition had rotted into control. Into threats. Into a fire set in the dark. Roy gripped the wheel tighter, the trailer swaying behind him. Trigger moved inside, calm, like he knew what was coming. The gates of Dry Creek stood tall and black, flanked by two stone pillars like grave markers. Roy didn't wait to be invited. He drove straight through, gravel crunching under his tires, dust rising like smoke. The main house loomed ahead, too big, too clean for land this tired. Wade Mercer was already outside, leaning against a porch post with a tumbler in one hand and a smirk carved into his face. "Well," he said, "didn't think you had it in you, Roy." Roy stepped out of the truck without a word. The heat pressed down like a hand on his back. "I didn't come to talk," he said. "I came to end it." Mercer's smile faded. "You still clingin' to that story? That your boy died, 'cause of me?" Roy nodded slowly. "Not just clingin', I finally believe it." He walked toward the trailer, unlatched the door, and led Trigger out. The pony stood firm on the gravel, eyes fixed on Mercer, unblinking. Mercer stepped forward, a shadow crossing his face. "That animal's mine. Always was." Roy positioned himself between Trigger and the man. "No, he was never yours. You broke animals to prove you could. Daniel didn't steal this horse. He saved him." The silence that followed was thick, dangerous. Mercer's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around the glass. "You wanna make this legal?" he hissed. "Fine. Let's take it to court. You'll lose." Roy took one slow step forward. "Maybe. But this time, I'll go down swinging. And I'll drag your name through every inch of Texas to do it." For a long moment, Mercer didn't speak. Then he tossed the glass to the dirt, the sound sharp as gunfire. "You always were too stubborn to know when you'd lost." He turned and walked inside, slamming the door behind him. Roy stood still. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. For the first time in years, he felt like a man who had nothing left to hide, and nothing left to fear. Because sometimes, standing your ground is the only fight that matters. The morning after the confrontation, Roy didn't drive home right away. He parked his truck just outside of town, next to the old fairgrounds where Daniel had once won his first ribbon. The place was quiet now, the grandstands empty, the banners long faded. Trigger stood tethered nearby, calmly grazing beneath the same oaks that had once echoed with cheers. Roy sat on the tailgate, hat in his hands, letting the silence do what time never could, mend the broken places. He had left Mercer's land without a fight, but also without backing down. Wade hadn't followed, hadn't made another threat. Maybe he'd realized something Roy had just now come to understand. Some things can't be bought back, bullied back, or buried forever. Mercer could keep his money. Roy had something far more valuable: truth and the weight of his son's courage behind it. As the wind rustled through the trees, Roy reached into the glove box and pulled out Daniel's note, the one he'd found folded in the coffee can. He read it again, slower this time, not just for the warning, but for the voice behind the words. His boy had been brave. Braver than Roy had ever known. And now, all these years later, Trigger stood as the last living proof of that bravery. Not a broken animal. Not a relic. But a survivor. A witness. Roy called Clay Turner later that afternoon and told him everything. The note, the fire, the history. Clay agreed to take it to the sheriff and promised that, this time, Mercer wouldn't go untouched. The town had changed. People had changed. And men like Wade were finally losing the grip they'd held for far too long. Roy didn't care if the law took years. He just needed to know that someone was watching now. That Mercer wouldn't be allowed to hurt anyone else. Back at the ranch, Trigger ran through the pasture with a strange lightness in his steps. It was subtle, but Roy noticed. The animal that had once stood frozen in shame was now moving with purpose, tail raised, head held just a little higher. Roy watched from the fence, arms crossed, heart full. He knew he was an old man. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel hollow. He felt whole. As the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Roy walked toward the barn with Trigger following close behind. The ghosts were quieter now. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had finally loosened its grip. What remained was enough. Enough to forgive. Enough to remember. And enough to start again. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more emotional true stories. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next.